They do not tell you what lives in the warp, not truly. They give you the words. They say, void between realities, sea of souls, the Empyrean. They teach you the prayers and the procedures and the 11-step ignition sequence for the Gellar field generator, and they tell you that the field will protect you. And you believe them, because what choice do you have? You are 10,000 light-years from Terra on a ship with no engines that can carry you home except the ones that cut through that place. And so you believe. You repeat the catechism. You trust the prayers. You do not think about what waits on the other side of the hull, separated from your sleeping body by 3 inches of sanctified plating and a field of psychic light sustained by a mutant child who has never seen the sun. My name is Edric Sorn. For 11 years I served as primary systems archivist aboard the void-pilgrim vessel Perseverance of Saint Alathea. Chartist merchant fleet, registered out of Cypra Mundi. I maintained the field generator logs. I documented every fluctuation, every prayer cycle, every deviation from nominal. I was good at my work. My supervisor once told me my logs were so immaculate they would outlast the ship herself. He was right. They did. The ship did not. I am recording this testimony from a shelter I will not name, on a world I will not identify. 42 days after the Perseverance of Saint Alathea emerged from a 7-week warp transit with 911 of her 1,400 souls intact. What happened in those 7 weeks is what I am here to tell you, not because anyone has asked me to, not because I believe it will change anything, but because I spent 11 years archiving records, and the archivist in me cannot let truth go unlogged. Someone must know. Someone must remember what the Gellar field truly is, and what it costs, and who pays that cost in silence, in the dark, while the rest of us sleep. I didn't know then what I would come to understand by the end. I didn't know that the warmth I felt each morning when the field chorus sang at dawn was not merely a machine performing its function. I didn't know that when the Navigator spoke of the warp in hushed tones, they were protecting us from a comprehension that would break most minds. I didn't know that the procedures I logged so immaculately were not descriptions of a technology. They were a description of a sacrifice so old and so continuous that the Imperium had built an entire liturgy around not examining it too closely. I know now. This is how I learned that every journey through the warp is a negotiation with something that cannot be bargained with, sustained by something that cannot be replaced, and protected by grace that is neither mechanical nor divine, but something in between that the Imperium calls neither, because naming it honesty would be more than most souls could carry. The Perseverance of Saint Alathea had been making the Cypra Mundi to Bacca run for 63 years, when I came aboard as a junior archivist at 24 years of age. She was an old ship. Old ships accumulate character the way old men accumulate silence, and the Perseverance had both in abundance. Her corridors smelled of promethium and incense, and something older underneath, a mineral smell, like deep rock, like buried things. Her crew moved through her passages with a particular unhurried confidence of people who have made peace with their environment, no matter how strange that environment was. I had crossed the void once before, a short transit from my birth world to Cypra Mundi, 6 weeks in the warp. Unremarkable. I remember the slight wrongness of warp. Transit, the way sound seemed to arrive from the wrong direction, the way you would sometimes wake from sleep, certain that something had been standing at the end of your bunk, looking at you. Dreams, more vivid than anything you'd experience, planet-side. A low-grade headache that lasted the full transit and vanished the moment you emerged into real space. Standard, normal. The priest said it was the soul sensing the proximity of the Empyrean and responding with appropriate spiritual disquiet. The medici said it was the body reacting to the subtle gravitational distortions inherent in warp passage. I believe both explanations equally, and neither of them deeply, and I slept well enough, and I thought no more of it. That was before I began archiving the field logs. My first week aboard the Perseverance, my supervisor, Archivist Senior Demetria Osk, handed me a leather-bound operations manual the size of a small child, and told me to read it 3 times before I touched a single console. I read it 4 times. I was thorough. I believed in thoroughness. The manual described the Gellar field generator in the language of the Adeptus Mechanicus, dense with notation and ritual procedure, organised around 11 primary prayer cycles and 47 contingency rites for field deviation. It explained the field as a projection of psychic energy that maintained a bubble of real space physics around the ship during warp transit, preventing the energies of the Empyrean from intruding upon the vessel. It explained the generator as a magnificent machine, wholly in its complexity, the product of 10,000 years of accumulated Mechanicus wisdom. It did not explain the choir. I learned about the choir on my third day, when Demetria took me on a full systems inspection and we descended to the lower decks, past crew berthing, past cargo holds, past the sealed bulkheads of the Navigator's tow. Down into the forward underbelly of the ship, where the hum of the engines was replaced by something different. A sound that did not come through the ears, a resonance that came through the sternum and the back teeth, a frequency felt rather than heard. Demetria walked without comment. I followed. The corridor narrowed, then terminated at a blast door sealed with 11 locks, each requiring a different authorization key. She produced all 11 from a ring at her belt. I counted. I was always counting things. Beyond the blast door was a chamber I had no vocabulary for at 24 years of age. It was round, perhaps 15 meters in diameter, the walls curving up to meet in a dome overhead. The floor was engraved with concentric circles of text I could not read, in a script I did not recognize, worn smooth by what I would later calculate had been at least 60 years of bare feet walking the same paths. In the centre of the chamber, connected to the walls and to the generator housing by cables and conduits of every gauge, were 17 figures. They were seated in high-backed chairs of a design I could not determine the material of. They were attached to their chairs by restraints that I would, over the following months, come to understand were there not to contain them but to hold them upright, because without support they would have collapsed. They were thin in the way of people for whom physical maintenance has become secondary to some other, more consuming purpose. They ranged in apparent age from perhaps 13 to somewhere north of 60, though age was difficult to assess accurately. Their eyes were closed, their lips moved without sound, or with sounds too low for me to hear from the chamber entrance. The cables that connected them to the generator housing pulsed with a light that had no source I could identify. A faint golden luminescence that bright, tinted and dimmed in rhythm with something, breathing, perhaps, or heartbeat, though it did not match any one person's rhythm, but rather the collective rhythm of all 17 at once. I stood in the doorway for perhaps 30 seconds before Demetria touched my arm and led me back into the corridor and sealed the blast door behind us. She did not comment on my expression. She replaced all 11 keys on their ring. "The choir," she said, "sustains the field. They require 18 hours per day of active channeling during transit and 6 hours of rest. During rest cycles, the field is maintained by the auxiliary generator. The auxiliary generator was built 200 years ago and has not been replaced. You will log its power readings every 4 hours and report any deviation of more than 3% to me directly at any hour." "What are they?" I said. "Sanctioned psychers," she said. "Astropaths, primarily those whose soul binding has been turned from communication to sustenance. Some are shipborne, trained for this purpose. Some were transferred from other vessels." "How long have they been doing this?" She paused for a moment before answering. Not because she didn't know, I realized later, because she was deciding what to tell me. The senior member of the choir, the woman in the central chair, has been with the Perseverance for 23 years. I did not ask what happened to choir members who could no longer serve. That question did not occur to me then. I was 24, and thorough, and I believed in systems, and I understood that some components of a system required maintenance I was not qualified to perform, and that my function was the logs, and the logs were where I would direct my attention. I went back to my bunk that evening and wrote up my first daily archive entry in the careful, precise hand Demetria had told me she expected. I noted the choir's composition, 17 members. I noted the auxiliary generator's power levels. I noted the 11-lock blast door and its authorization requirements. I noted that the central choir member had been in that chair for 23 years. I did not note what that meant. I did not think about it. I sealed my personal archive and slept, and I dreamed vividly, as I had learned to expect during transit. And in the morning the field chorus sang at dawn, and the resonance moved through my sternum like warmth, and I rose and said my prayers and went to work. In 11 years of service I made 41 warp transits aboard the Perseverance of Saint Alathea. Each transit logged meticulously, each choir cycle documented. I became, over time, something of an expert in the rhythms of the field, the particular signatures of each choir member's contribution, the subtle variations that preceded a fluctuation, the way the auxiliary generator sounded different in the second hour of a rest cycle versus the sixth. I knew the field the way a physician knows a patient's heartbeat, not just the readings, but the quality beneath the readings, the texture of the thing. I also came to know the choir insofar as anyone outside the choir truly could. Contact was discouraged. Not forbidden, precisely, but discouraged with a particular institutional discouragement that functions as a softer version of prohibition. Choir members during rest cycle were attended by a small staff of Medicaid orderlies and one choir warden, a taciturn woman named Bereska, who had been managing the choir's physical welfare for 11 years before I arrived and continued to manage it after. They ate during rest cycle, bland nutritive paste administered through whatever means each member could manage. They slept, or something that resembled sleep. They were brought to a small adjacent room for hygiene maintenance. Then death. I returned to their chairs, and the cables were reattached, and the light returned to their eyes, or rather, the light returned to the space where their eyes looked outward, and they resumed the channeling. I learned their names because I logged their names. Every choir member had a designation in the field logs, a number and a code name assigned by the Mechanicus when they were integrated into the generator system. But they also had the names they'd been born with, and in my personal supplementary archive I recorded both because I believed in completeness. Archivist Senior Demetria Osk would likely have called this excessive. She was probably right, but I believe now, in a way I did not then articulate, that I recorded their names because somewhere underneath the efficiency and the thoroughness, some part of me recognized that these were people and that recording only their system designations would be an inadequacy, though I could not then have told you what sort of inadequacy. The senior member, the woman in the central chair, had been born with the name Eilina, just Elena, ship-born from a void runner out of the Segmentum Solar. Her records showed brought to the Perseverance at 16 after her abilities manifested and after the appropriate sanctioning procedures were completed. She was 39 when I joined the crew. She was the strongest channeler in the choir by a margin that showed clearly in the field readings, her contribution accounting for roughly 28% of the field's total output, despite being only one of 17 members. She did not speak during rest cycles. She ate her nutritive paste without apparent interest. She slept deeply and woke, in my observation, with something that might be called gratitude, or might be called relief, though relief at what I could not determine. That she had woken, perhaps, that she was still herself. The 6 hours of rest had been sufficient to let her return from wherever the 18 hours of channeling took her. I spoke to her once, in my 3rd year aboard the Perseverance, by accident. I had come to perform an unscheduled generator inspection during a rest cycle. A reading had seemed slightly elevated, and I wanted to verify it personally before logging it as anomalous. And in the small room adjacent to the choir chamber, I found Eilina sitting alone on a cot, the medici orderly apparently elsewhere, eating her nutritive paste with the slow mechanical focus of someone for whom eating had become purely functional. I stopped in the doorway and began to back out, but she looked up. Her eyes were the flat silver grey of overcast sky. She had probably been quite striking at 16. By 39, the sustained channeling had printed itself on her face in a way I couldn't have described precisely, but recognized. A withdrawal of something, as though the self behind the eyes was present, but at a remove, conducting its business from behind glass. "You're the archivist," she said. Not a question. Her voice was steady, low register, unhurried. "Archivist Sorn." "Yes," I said. "I apologize for the intrusion. I'm just verifying a reading." "The reading is fine," she said. Choir Node 9 is running warm. I've mentioned it to Bereska. She'll have it adjusted in the next cycle. I looked at her. She looked back at me with that glass window expression. You can feel them? I said, the nodes individually. I can feel everything, she said. The generator, the auxiliary, the cables, the field itself. She took another spoonful of the paste without looking at it. You can feel the ship's heartbeat when you've been connected to it long enough. It's not unpleasant. A pause. It is not pleasant either. It is simply what is. I should have said something professional and left. Instead, I said, how long have you been connected to this particular ship? She looked at me with an expression that I could not read at the time, and have spent considerable effort trying to reconstruct in the 42 days since the transit ended. It was not pain, it was not reproach. It was something more like the look of a person who has been asked a question they have answered many times, and have long since stopped expecting the asker to understand the answer. 23 years, she said. How long does a choir member typically serve? I said, and I still do not know why I asked it, except that the archivist in me always moved toward information, always wanted to complete the record, a long pause. Not the pause of someone deciding what to say, the pause of someone deciding whether to say anything at all. You should verify your reading, archivist, she said, and turned back to her paste. I verified the reading, logged it, returned to my workstation. Choir Node 9 was recalibrated in the next cycle, as she had predicted. I added a note to her file that she had demonstrated awareness of node-level field variations without direct mechanical interface. Then I filed it and did not think about the question I had asked, or the pause before she had refused to answer it, for another 7 years. The transit that ended everything began on the 214th day of the 791st year of the current millennium, by the Imperial Standard Calendar. A 1409-day route from Bacca to a subsector supply depot I will not name. Estimated warp transit duration 11 weeks. Standard. Unremarkable. I logged the departure. I logged the pre-transit systems checks, I logged the field ignition sequence, and I logged the choir's transition to active channeling status. All 17 members connected, all 17 readings nominal. The was nothing in those logs to indicate what the next 7 weeks would become. The first 11 days were exactly what I would have expected from an experienced crew on a route they had run many times. The choir cycled with their customary regularity, the field held steady. The auxiliary generator performed within acceptable parameters. The senior navigator set our course through the currents of the Empyrean, with the practiced confidence of a woman who had been navigating this vessel for 14 years. I logged everything. I noted 2 minor fluctuations, both within normal range, both corrected before they could develop. I ate my meals, I slept, and dreamed, and woke, and worked. The days of a warp transit have a quality of compressed sameness that experienced void hands find comfortable. You learn to move through them without too much examination. On the 12th day, at 4 hours past the middle night bell, Choir Node 3 failed completely. The alarm brought me from my bunk at a run. I reached the generator room in 4 minutes, faster than I had ever covered that distance before, faster than I knew I could. Demetria was already there, and Bereska, and 2 Medicae orderlies, and the Navigator herself, which I had never seen before in 11 years. Navigator Preth stood against the far wall with her blindfold tight over her third eye, her hands clasped at her back, watching with an expression of careful professional stillness. Node 3 was one of the newer choir members, a young man of perhaps 22, 7 months aboard, transferred from a destroyed pilgrim vessel whose records indicated he had been performing admirably. His chair was dark, the cables had been disconnected, he was slumped to one side, and the orderly was verifying his pulse with the efficiency of long practice. "Dead," I said. "Unconscious," the orderly said. "Severe neural shock." He won. To be channeling again this transit. The field readings had dipped 4% in the seconds between Node 3's failure and the remaining 16 members compensating. 4% was within the tolerance range. But for 4 seconds, the edge of the bubble of real space that surrounded the Perseverance of Saint Alathea, had thinned from its standard depth, and in those 4 seconds before compensation, something had changed in the ambient sensation of the ship that everyone present could feel and no one mentioned. Demetria had the orderlies remove Node 3 from the chamber. The chair was cleared. 16 members remained. I ran the projections on my data slate, standing in the corridor outside the blast door, while Demetria conferred with the Navigator in low tones. 16 channelers, same route, same scheduled duration. The field would hold. It would hold at reduced capacity, but it would hold. The auxiliary generator could compensate for the reduced output during rest cycles. I logged the failure. I logged the reduced choir count. I noted that the field projections remained within acceptable parameters. I filed the log and returned to my bunk and tried to sleep, and could not, though I could not then have told you why. The next 4 days were uneventful. On the 17th day, at the 2nd hour past the first dawn bell, the auxiliary generator failed. I want you to understand what the auxiliary generator represented, because I did not fully understand it myself until I sat in the generator room watching its power readings drop, not suddenly, but gradually, with the particular malevolence of a machine that does not know it is supposed to keep working. The auxiliary generator was the contingency. It was the safety margin. It was what kept the field running during the 6 hours each day when the choir was resting, and required to rest, because the kind of suster. In psychic effort required to maintain a Gellar field across 11 weeks of transit cannot be performed continuously without breaking the minds performing it. The choir worked 18 hours. They rested 6. The auxiliary generator covered the rest. It had been doing this for 200 years. It stopped doing it on the 17th day. Demetria called the ship's senior mechanicus priest a magos by the name of Orthus, whose augmentations were so extensive that it was difficult to determine where the machine components ended and the biological ones began. He spent 3 hours inside the generator housing. He emerged and reported in the flat, tonal voice of a man for whom machine failure is a theological problem before it is a practical one, that the primary power coil had fractured along a fault that should have been detected at the last maintenance interval. It had not been detected. He did not know why. He was uncertain when it had begun to fracture, only that it had, and that repair was possible but would require pulling components from secondary systems. He believed he could have a partial restoration of function within 18 hours. In the meantime, the auxiliary could not be relied upon. He was correct that repair was possible. He completed it in 16 hours. In those 16 hours, the choir rested for only 2 of their scheduled 6. They could have refused. I do not know, even now, what would have happened if they had. The field would have weakened significantly during an unprotected rest cycle. How significantly, the projections could not accurately determine, because a field maintained by a warp-tired choir working beyond their safe endurance is not a stable enough system to model with confidence. Eilina had spoken with Magos Orthus directly. For the first time in the 11 years I had been aboard, I was not present for that conversation. I know only what Bereska told me afterward, which was that the conversation had lasted 11 minutes, and that at the end of it the choir had returned to active channeling status 4 hours before their designated rest cycle ended. Bereska told me this without commentary. She had the manner of someone who had learned, over a long career, to observe things carefully and to say only what was necessary about what she observed. I asked her if she had objected to the decision. She looked at me for a moment. "What would my objection have changed?" she said. It was not a question. I logged the auxiliary generator failure, the repair timeline, and the choir's extended channeling cycle. I noted in my supplementary archive that choir rest had been reduced to 2 hours. I did not then annotate this with its consequences because the consequences had not yet materialized, and I was an archivist, not a prophet. But I sat in the generator room for a long time after filing that entry. Watching the field readings and what I was feeling, though I would not have named it then, was the beginning of understanding that the thing I had been meticulously logging for 11 years was not quite what I had believed it to be. You must understand something about the warp, and I will tell you what I know of it, which is filtered through 11 years of logs and 1 navigator's off-duty confidences, and 7 weeks of a transit that taught me more than I was equipped to survive knowing. The warp is not empty. The priests teach that the Empyrean is a spiritual dimension, the echo of mortal emotion made manifest, the realm through which the Emperor's light is said to shine, and through which his servants may travel in his grace. The Navigator's Codex, to which I was granted limited access in my 5th year of service for the purposes of accurate field documentation, describes it in more technical terms, a hyperdimensional medium in which the psychic resonance of sentient life accumulates over millions of years into structures, currents, and what the Codex calls inimical presences. The Codex uses that phrase with the careful neutrality of documentation. Inimical presences. In her 8th year of service with the Perseverance, Navigator Preth drank slightly more low wine than was her custom at the ship's Emperor's Day celebration, and she told me something that did not appear in the Codex. She told me that what most people imagined when they thought about the warp, a dark, formless void, a turbulent sea, was incomplete. The warp was not formless. It had a form. That form was awareness. Not the awareness of any one entity or intelligence, though entities and intelligences existed within it in forms human language had no adequate vocabulary for. The awareness was the medium itself. She said, "The warp knows you are there. It is always known. The moment a ship translates into the Empyrean, the moment the warp surrounds the hull, every presence within it becomes aware of the new arrival." Not curious, she said, hungry is not quite the right word either. The warp does not experience hunger as an emoti. It simply orients toward life the way flame orients towards oxygen. It is not malice. It is nature. And the Gellar field is, in essence, a very small, very fragile argument against that nature. A bubble of light in a sea that has existed for an eternity and will continue existing after the bubble collapses, pressed against the hull, waiting for the argument to end. I thought about this conversation often after the 17th day. The choir channeled through 16 hours and 2 hours of rest, and 16 more hours on the far side. When the auxiliary generator was restored to partial function, they were permitted 4 hours of rest rather than 6. Bereska reduced their nutritive intake schedule to fit. I watched the field readings throughout. The field held. It held at 92% of standard output, because 16 channelers working through insufficient rest were producing 92% of what 17 rested channelers produced. 92% of standard output was within tolerance. I logged it as within tolerance. I believed it was within tolerance. I was correct in a technical sense. I was missing a context I did not yet have. Not because no one knew it, but because the information about what the tolerance margins actually meant, what the difference between full output and 92% output meant in terms of what was pressing against the outside of that field, was not archived in any document to which I had access. It was not that the information was classified exactly, it was that no one had considered it worth documenting for my benefit. What pressed against the hull was a given, the way gravity was a given. You did not document gravity for the benefit of someone standing on a world's surface. The documentation was written for people who had reason to think about it, and an archivist was not one of those people. The Navigator, Ken. The choir knew. Bereska, I believe, knew or understood as much as a non-psychic mind could understand, which was enough. The rest of the crew did not know. I did not know. We trusted the procedures, and the procedures held the field, and the field held the dark away from the hull, and we continued as normal. On the 21st day of transit, Alina asked to speak with me. Bereska delivered the request personally, which was unprecedented. I followed her down to the lower decks at the 5th hour past the midday bell, through the narrowing corridors, past the blast door with its 11 locks, and into the rest chamber where Elena was seated on her cot with both hands wrapped around a cup of something hot, recaf or a facsimile of it. She looked the same as she always looked during rest cycles, withdrawn, present from behind glass, the cup's warmth rising into her thin hands. 27 years in that chair, 39 years old when I boarded, and I was now 35, which made her 50, though she might have passed for either decade without effort. So thoroughly had the transit years eaten the usual markers of age from her face. She waited until Bereska had left the room. Then she looked at me with those flat grey eyes and said, "The field is degrading." I said, The readings are within tolerance. The readings, she said, measure what the generator produces. They don't measure what the field is doing with it. She held the cup without drinking from it. Sit down, Archivist. I sat. She said, you have been logging field data for 11 years, and you do not know what the field actually does. This is not a criticism. You were not supposed to know there is a category of information that the Mechanicus does not publish, because publishing it would require explaining what we are and what we do in terms that most people are not. She paused. Equipped to REM, ain functional after understanding. I said nothing. The Gellar field, she said, is not a mechanical barrier. It is not like a hull plate or a void shield. A hull plate repels physical force, a void shield redirects energy. The Gellar field does something different. It maintains a reality. She stopped, seemed to consider whether this was adequate, and continued. The warp is conscious, or close enough to conscious that the distinction is academic. When a ship transits the Empyrean, that consciousness becomes aware of the ship. It presses against the field not with physical force, but with intent. The field resists the intent with something of its own. That something is us. She looked down at the cup. Not the generator. The generator is the medium, the housing. We are the substance of the field, our minds, our sanity, our sense of what is real and what is not, pressed out through the cables and the housing, and sustained against whatever the warp brings to bear against us. A pause. When we sleep, the generator maintains the shape without the substance, like an empty vessel. The warp knows the difference. I said because I was an archivist, and this was information. How does it know? How does fire know the difference between wet wood and dry, she said. It presses harder. I had my data slate with me, because I always had my data slate with me. I looked at the field readings, 92% output, stable within tolerance. What does 92% mean, I said, in terms of what it's holding back? The glass window expression shifted slightly, not to pain, to something more like the particular patience of a person who has known a truth for a long time and has arrived at the point of telling it without hope that telling it will help anything. You know the fluctuations that you log, she said. The 3% deviations that you mark as normal. The E-field dipping and recovering. You log these as routine events. They are routine, they are normal, she said. They are not routine. Each fluctuation is a point of contact, the warp pressing and the field pushing back. Most of the time, the field holds. Sometimes the pressure finds a point of weakness in something. She stopped again. A long pause. Something passes the boundary. Not fully. Usually not fully. Usually a fraction of an entity too large to fit entire through a 3% fluctuation. An impression. A fragment of awareness. A voice. She looked at me steadily. Have you ever heard voices during transit? Dreams, I said. The priests say it's the proximity of the Empyrean. Yes, she said. I imagine they do. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the rest chamber, the generator hummed, and somewhere beyond the hull, the warp pressed against the field, and 16 exhausted minds held the shape of reality in place. I thought about the dreams I had not examined very closely in 11 years of regular warp transit, the vivid, specific, sometimes architectural dreams, the dreams that felt occasionally as though they were happening to someone watching from inside my skull, rather than to me directly. The voices I had logged in my own sleep log as static, the hypnagogic effects of Empyrean proximity. Standard. Unremarkable. What happens, I said carefully, at 75%? Eilina set down her cup. She looked at the generator housing through the wall in the way she sometimes looked at things, as though the wall were not there, which for her it perhaps was not. At 75%, she said, the field can no longer adequately compensate for sustained contact from major entities. A minor presence can breach the boundary completely. What that means for the crew depends on the nature of the presence and the structural integrity of the H. All materials. The Mechanicus has extensive documentation on this. It is not documentation they distribute to archivists. We are currently at 92%, I said. Yes, she said. And we are 17 members, I said. 16, she said. Senna is still not channeling. He is recovering. but he will not channel again this transit. I ran projections I had never run before, because I had never had reason to. 16 channelers operating on insufficient rest cycles, 1,400 souls aboard, 17 transit days remaining. The field would not drop to 75% through normal attrition. The projections were clear on this. Unless another member failed, unless the rest cycles were cut further, unless something external increased the pressure on the field, which Elena had just explained to me was a variable that my projections had no data to account for. "What are you telling me?" I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "I'm telling you," she said, "what it is. Not what will happen. I don't know what will happen. I have been doing this for 27 years, and I have had bad transits and good transits and everything between, and I know what the readings mean in ways the readings don't show, and what they mean right now is that we are within tolerance, and I am not confident in the tolerance." She picked up the cup again. "I am telling you because you have been logging this ship for 11 years, and you have never known what you were logging. And I am—" She stopped, started again. "I am tired of the only people who know what this is being. The people who are too connected to the field to think about it clearly, and the only people who think about it clearly being people who don't know what it is." She drank her recaf, or facsimile of recaf. The rest psych. E had 40 minutes remaining. I thanked her, because I had no other words that seemed adequate, and I went back to my workstation, and I sat in front of my field data logs, 11 years of immaculate documentation, and I began reading them for the first time with the knowledge of what they actually recorded. The 24th day, node 11 failed during the 18th hour of a channeling cycle. At the 9th hour, past the middle night bell. Not death, not this time, but a complete sensory breakdown, a collapse of the signal between the channeler's mind and the generator housing, which Eilina later described to me as the equivalent of a limb going numb, except the limb was the part of her mind that touched the field. The orderlies disconnected her cables, the field reading dipped to 87% during the 8 seconds it took the remaining 15 to compensate. 8 seconds at 87%. The ship shuddered, not mechanically, not structurally. There was no engine failure, no hull stress, no physical phenomenon I could record in the standard engineering log. The shudder moved through the Perseverance of Saint Alathea in the way that sound moves through water. Not heard exactly, felt. A vibration that began at the hull and moved inward through every surface until it passed through the crew themselves, and for the 3 seconds it lasted, every person aboard the ship, 1,400 souls, experienced something that no two people would have described identically, but that everyone would recognize when they heard anyone else describe it. The sensation of being looked at by something very large, by something that was not interrupted by the metal and the void and the distance between itself and you. By something that had, for those 3 seconds, reduced the space between its attention and your existence to nothing at all. And then the field compensated, and the sensation stopped, and the hull was just a hull again, and the warp was just the warp, and the shudder was over. I logged it. My hands were not steady when I did. I wrote, "Minor field fluctuation, 87% duration, 8 seconds, cause node failure. Compensated." I wrote it in the same careful hand I had used. For 11 years, it took 4 attempts before the handwriting was clean enough to file. I went to Bereska directly afterward and said, "How many rest hours is the choir receiving?" She said, 3 per cycle. When Magos Authors fully restores the auxiliary generator, the standard 6 hours will return. Full restoration is not achievable this transit, she said. The components he removed from secondary systems for the repair were from the field modulation array. He can restore them at Baka, not before. I said, "So the choir will be running on 3 hours of rest for the remaining 13 days of transit." She looked at me, something passed across her face. Not warmth exactly, but a recognition of the fact that I was finally asking the right questions. "Yes," she said, "and they will lose more members before we reach the transit point. They have always lost members on difficult transits. The field has always held. The Perseverance has run this route 43 times. The Perseverance has never run this route with a generator in this condition and 16 channelers on 3 hours of rest," I said. "No," she said, "she has not. I went to Navigator Preth and asked whether we could shorten the transit by pushing the warp current harder. She listened to me with the careful attention of someone who has learned that non-navigators occasionally ask questions whose answers are illuminating. She said, "Faster transit produces greater warp pressure. The currents I am navigating are the calmest paths available. A shorter route exists, but it moves through regions of the Empyrean that would increase the pressure on the field by approximately 40%. I went to Magos Authors and asked about full restoration of the auxiliary generator. He gave me the same answer he had given Bereska. Not this transit. I sat in the generator room for 3 hours, watching the readings, watching 15 exhausted minds hold the edge of reality in place. 3 hours of rest at a time, and I did what archivists do. I compiled the data, I completed the picture. 15 channelers, 3 hours of rest. 13 days remaining. A warp environment pressing at the boundary with enough awareness to feel the field's quality, the way you can feel the difference between a good lock and a cheap one, even when both are locked. The auxiliary generator running at 43% of design capacity, enough to hold the shape, but not enough to hold the substance. Not what Elena had described as substance, which was the minds themselves, pressing back. The mathematics did not require an expert to read. But what they meant, what they truly meant, I did not yet fully understand. Not until the 28th day. Not until the thing that happened in Section 7 of the crew berthing decks, which I will come to now, though I want you to understand that what I am about to describe is not the most terrible thing that happened in those 7 weeks. The most terrible thing was something quieter and older, and it happened before any of this, and I did not recognize it until I had already logged it 211 times. Section 7 of the crew berthing decks was occupied primarily by lower deck crew, engine maintenance, cargo handlers, sanctification teams. 28 berths. On the 28th day of transit, at the 4th hour past the first dawn bell, 2 hours into the rest cycle, I was in the generator room, running routine readings, when the Vox grill crackled, and I heard very clearly Bereska's voice saying, "Archivist Sorn to Section 7 berthing." Archivist Sorn to Section 7. She had never called me on the Vox grill. In 11 years of service, she had always come to find me. I went T. O Section 7 berthing. I took my data slate. The corridor outside the section was occupied by 6 crew members in various states of dress, standing at a remove from the sealed berth hatch, not in the way of people who have been told to stand back, but in the way of people who found themselves standing back without having decided to. Bereska was at the hatch. I went to her. She said quietly, close to my ear, "Archivist, I am going to show you something, and I need you to log it accurately, because I don't trust myself to log it without having seen it with someone else who can verify the log afterward." I said I would. She opened the berth hatch. 3 of the 6 berths in that section were occupied. 2 of the occupants, cargo handler Presson and his bunkmate, a sanctification junior whose name was in my secondary archive as Holt, were standing in their berths, upright in the manner of people who have woken from sleep and then been interrupted in the process of waking further. They were looking at the 3rd occupied berth. Their eyes were open. They did not blink when Bereska and I entered. They did not react to the light. In the 3rd berth, a woman named Tersa, lead cargo handler, 9 years aboard the Perseverance, was sitting up in her bunk and speaking. Her eyes were open. What she was saying was not in any language I had encountered in 11 years of service or 35 years of life. It moved through patterns that my mind kept trying to resolve into familiar structure and kept failing to resolve. A language with grammar and cadence, but with a grammar and cadence organized around principles that human cognition was not equipped to process directly. She was not frightened. She was not distressed. She was speaking with the particular purposeful focus of someone passing on a message of considerable importance. She was looking at nothing, or at something whirl. E could not see. I logged it. I logged every detail. My handwriting was very clean. I have thought about this since, about the fact that my handwriting was clean, that the archivist's discipline held even in that room. I don't know whether to be proud of that or horrified by it. Bereska sealed the berth again. She had the 2 conscious crew sedated and transferred to Medici. Tersa was sedated with significant difficulty. 3 orderlies, 2 ampoules of soporific, the second ampoule because after the first she continued speaking through the sedation while unconscious, the message apparently so important it did not require wakefulness. I went to Eilina at the next rest cycle and showed her my log of Section 7. She read it. She set my data slate on the cot beside her. She said nothing for a long time. 43 transits, I said. Has this happened before? Yes, she said. Is it logged? Not in documents you would have access to, she said. What is it? I said. She picked up the data slate and handed it back to me. During transit, when the field allows contact, presences in the warp seek the minds of unprotected crew. Not to harm, necessarily, not always with intent to harm. Some of what exists in the warp experiences human minds as, she paused, as a medium. The way you use a data slate to carry information you want to transmit. Some of what the warp contains has information it wants to transmit. It uses whatever medium is available. I thought about Tersa's face, the purposeful focus, the language that moved through cadences my mind could not resolve. What was she saying? I don't know, Elena said. I don't speak that language. Almost no one does. She looked at me with those flat grey eyes. The field at 87% during the shudder 4 days ago. That was a contact. Extended. 2 entities, from what I could feel on the field's edge. They found what they were looking for in Section 7, apparently. A pause. We are lucky they were the kind that speak. Most of them simply... She did not finish that sentence. I sat with all of this. The archivist in me was assembling the picture, piece by piece, the picture I had been logging without seeing for 11 years. 43 transits. Whatever happened on each of them, logged in documents I did not have access to. Choir members who served until they could not serve, replaced by others, the chairs never empty. Field fluctuations every transit, logged as routine, each one a contact with something pressing at the reality of the ship from outside. Tersa's voice speaking something's message in a language no one would transcribe, because to transcribe it would be to document what it meant to transit the warp with adequate and inadequate honesty. 21 years ago, I said, when you had been in the chair 4 years. A transit that went badly, what happened? She looked at me, not surprised. Who told you? No one told me. I inferred from the maintenance logs. A 6-week transit extended to 9 weeks. 4 choir members listed as deceased within a 3-day window. Hull section Tertius 11 sealed and listed as requiring sanctification. I paused. It's in the archive. If you know what you're reading, we lost the field for 47 seconds, she said. 4 of us broke under the contact. Hull section Tertius 11 had 17 crew. They were... She stopped. The glass window expression was in place, but something moved behind it. They were not recoverable, she said. The section was sealed, and the hull was vented, and the sanctification teams cleared what remained afterward. It took 3 weeks because they had to work in full protective equipment. What was in there was not... She closed her eyes. It was not what had been the crew. Not anymore. 47 seconds without the field. 17 crew in that section. I logged nothing for a long time after she finished. I sat in my workstation and looked at the field readings. 14 minutes past the 15th hour, rest cycle active. The auxiliary generator holding the shape. The warp on the other side of the hull, pressing against an empty vessel for its 6 hours of quiet assault. I thought about 17 million warp transits performed across the Imperium every year. Every transit ship carrying a choir. Every choir connected to a generator, pressing back the warp, on insufficient sleep, on nutritive paste, for years and then decades, until they could not press anymore and were replaced by others who would do the same. I thought about the administrative forms that tracked choir member service records, which I had seen in abstracted form in my 11 years of logs. Requests for replacement members filed with the appropriate ecclesiastical authorities, the particular language of those forms which referred to the outgoing choir member as transitioned, without specifying to what. I thought about what Goreska's "What would my objection have changed?" sounded like now on this side of knowing what I knew. I thought about the 1,400 souls aboard the Perseverance of Saint Alathea, sleeping in their berths during the rest cycle, dreaming vivid Empyrean dreams, the voices I had never examined too closely resolving themselves now into something I could not call static anymore. I thought about the fact that this was normal. This was every transit. This was 43 runs for this ship alone, and across the Imperium, across 10,000 years, a number too large for any archive, the accumulated weight of it, millions of choir members in millions of chairs, connected to millions of generators, pressing back the dark, their service. Recorded in documents no archivist could access, their names in secondary archives that would not survive them. I went to Captain Aldrich on the 29th day, and I told him what I had understood. I need to be precise about what I expected from that conversation. I am an archivist. My experience with authority was the experience of someone who serves the record, not the decision. I did not expect the captain to be surprised by what I told him. I did not expect him to share my reaction. I expected, I think, to be told to return to my station and continue my work, which was the response I had received on the one previous occasion, in 11 years when I had brought a concern to command authority. Captain Aldrich was 61 years old, a void-born Cypramundi native, 23 years commanding vessels on the Bacca run. He received me in his chart room, standing at the void map table, and he listened to what I had to say with his hands flat on the table's edge and his eyes on the map and not on me. When I finished, he was quiet for a time. He said, "Archivist, how long have you served?" I said, 11 years, Captain. He said, "I have served 41 years. I have made 207 warp transits. I know what the choir does. I know what is outside the hull." He looked up from the map then, and I saw in his face something I recognized from Eilena's face, the same quality of long-held knowledge, the exhaustion of someone who has been carrying information for decades that was too heavy for one person and has found no place to set it down. I know that we lose choir members on difficult transits and that they are replaced. I know that some transits are not survived by all aboard. I know that Section 7 is sedated and secured, and that when we reach the transit point, Tersa will be transferred to an ecclesiastical facility for evaluating. Ion and treatment, if treatment is possible. He looked back at the map. I know all of this, Archivist. What I do not know is what you expect me to do with what you have told me. I said, because I had not, in preparing for this conversation, adequately prepared for this. I don't know. No, he said. Neither do I. He turned back to the map. The transit continues, the choir maintains the field, we document what can be documented, we arrive or we do not. This is the nature of warp transit. It has been the nature of warp transit for 10,000 years. A pause. I have carried this knowledge for 23 years, Archivist. You have carried it for 4 days. I have no wisdom to offer you except that you learn to carry it or you break under it, and breaking serves no one. I said, "Did you choose to carry it?" He looked at me again. That question clearly landed somewhere it had not been expected. He said nothing for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I was told, as you were told, by someone who made the same decision I am making now, that you needed to know what you were logging." He picked up his recalf cup from the table's edge. His hand did not shake. "I cannot say the same about my own. Go back to your station, Archivist. Log what you observe." That is what we do. I logged what I observed. The field at 84% after a second minor fluctuation, 13 members active, 2 resting on rotating cycles to reduce the cumulative fatigue load. 10 transit days remaining. I logged it all very precisely. And I understood now, in a way I had not understood that morning, why the documents I did not have access to existed, and what they contained, and what the people who had written them had felt while writing them, and whether they had slept afterward. The 28th through 35th days are difficult to log in chronological sequence because they occurred with a quality of accumulating pressure that compressed time differently than normal transit. What I can tell you is what happened in order. Node 7 failed on the 31st day. 12 remaining. The field dropped to 79%, during the 4 minutes it took the diminished choir to compensate. In those 4 minutes, the ship shuddered twice, and in the crew common areas, 14 crew members simultaneously reported hearing what they described variously as music, voices, machinery, and in 2 cases the voices of people who were not aboard, including in one case the voice of a person 6 years dead. None of these crew members were in Section 7. They were distributed across the ship. The field compensated. The voices stopped. I logged all 14 reports personally. Navigator Preth came to the generator room at the 33rd day and stood looking at the choir through the blast door viewport for a long time. I was there running readings. She did not speak to me immediately. She had her blindfold pressed tight over her third eye, both hands raising the edges to ensure the seal, something I had seen her do before transit, and not since. When she finally turned to me, she said, "The currents are becoming agitated. Something large is moving in the Empyrean, not toward us, but the displacement is affecting the current structure. Transit will be extended by approximately 11 days. I did not say anything immediately. She said, 11 additional days, we have 12 channelers. We will lose more. I said, what is the probability of maintaining adequate field output for 11 additional days? She was quiet long enough that I had my answer. Then she said, I can navigate us through the edge of the disturbance at significant risk to myself. F and the ship structure shortening the extension to 6 days. Or I can navigate the longer path with the lower pressure for 11 days, a higher pressure route with fewer days, or a lower pressure route with more days. Neither option is what I would choose if I had better options. I said, what does Eileen say? I have not spoken to her. The navigator said, the decision is mine. She manages the field. I manage the course. They are the same decision, I said. The navigator looked at me. For a moment, something in her professionally steady face shifted, not quite gratitude, but the recognition that she was not alone in knowing something. She said, yes, they are. She chose the shorter path, 6 additional days of higher pressure rather than 11 of lower. She made this decision at the 33rd day with 12 channelers remaining. I do not know what she was calculating when she made it. I know what I was calculating, and my calculation did not account for variables I could not model. Neither did hers, I think. Neither did anyone's. We were all working from incomplete information, making the best decisions we could with the data available. In the way that people always make decisions about systems that are too large and too complex and too old to be fully legible to any single observer. This is, I understood then, the nature of every decision ever made about warp transit. It has always been this way. The Imperium built its civilization on the assumption that the procedures were sufficient, that the tolerance margins were adequate, that what was logged was what was real. On the 38th day, the field dropped to 73% for 9 seconds during a major fluctuation, the largest I had ever recorded. 9 of the choir's 10 remaining channelers had been awake for 19 hours. The auxiliary generator was running at 37% of DES. Igni capacity. The warp current disturbance was pressing against the hull with the focused patience of something that has been pressing for a very long time and has learned that pressure and patience are the same thing. 73%. For 9 seconds. Section 7's berth had been sealed and is still sealed. What I am able to tell you about those 9 seconds is limited by both my own experience of them and by a decision I have made about what belongs in a testimony and what belongs in the nightmare. I will tell you that the 9 seconds were experienced differently by different crew members. I will tell you that the sounds that were heard were not uniform. I will tell you that the field's compensation when it came was driven not by the generator alone, but by something else, something that Eileen described to me afterward as the choir burning through their reserve in a single sustained push that she said she had never done before and would not survive doing twice. I will tell you that when the 9 seconds ended, we had 8 channelers. 2 had been lost in the compensation push. One of them was Elena. I do not think she knew when she made the push that it would cost her that. I think she knew it might. I think the distinction may have been less important to her than it would have been to someone who had not spent 27 years in that chair, learning the difference between what she was and what the chair needed her to be. I found out from Bereska, who found out because the readings flatlined on Elena's node and did not recover. I sat in the generator room for a long time afterward. I had my data slate. I did not log immediately. I thought about the 27 years. I thought about brown nutritive paste and recaf, and a conversation 3 years into my service about the nature of Gellar fields and what they actually were. I thought about the question I had asked in my 3rd year about how long she had been connected to this ship, and the pause before she had not answered it. I thought about 39 and 50, and 23 years in a chair, and the way she had said it is what it is with a flatness. That was not resignation, not acceptance in the conventional sense, but something that had passed through acceptance so thoroughly it no longer required the word. I logged her death at 1 hour and 17 minutes past the 38th day's middle night bell. No designation, primary channel alpha. Name, Elena. Age, 50 years. Cause, critical neural exhaustion, sustained channeling push. Field compensation event. Service duration, 27 years. I wrote it in the careful hand I'd used for 11 years. Clean lines. Complete record. We emerged from the warp transit on the 49th day. 7 weeks. 911 souls of 1,400. 7 channelers remaining of the original 17, 2 of the 7 already categorized as permanently unable to return to active service. Section 7, berthing sealed. 42 crew listed as deceased from causes that the ship's formal death log categorized in terms I will not reproduce here. Because they required a specific vocabulary, I will not help normalize. I sat in my workstation on the day of our emergence into real space, and I looked at my 11 years of logs, and I looked at the logs from this transit, and I thought about how to archive what I had understood. The archivist in me wanted to complete the record. The complete record, would contain the following true things. The Gellar field is sustained not by the generator but by the minds of sanctioned psykers who spend their service lives in chairs connected to that generator, with insufficient rest on inadequate nutrition, for years and then decades until they fail and are replaced and the chairs are never empty. The procedures exist not because they are adequate, but because they are what is available. The tolerance margins are calculated to survive most transits, not all transits. The documents that contain the honest accounting of what warp transit costs are not accessible to the people whose lives depend on the transit succeeding. The 1,400 souls who sleep in their berths during a warp crossing are sleeping inside the active protection of minds that are paying a price they did not negotiate and cannot decline. What presses against the hull is not nothing, and what holds it back is not a machine. This is true. This has been true for 10,000 years. This will be true for the next transit and the one after that, and every transit until the Imperium itself ends, or until someone builds a Gellar field that does not require someone to be burning inside it. I thought about Captain Uldrich's question, "What do you expect me to do with this?" I still don't have an answer. I did not have a one then, and I do not have one now. 42 days later, in this shelter, I will not name. I know what I have done with it, which is this. I have written it down. I have made the complete record that the Administratum would not make, and the Mechanicus has chosen not to distribute, and the Navy archives in sealed files no archivist can access. Not because it will change anything. I have no illusions about that. The transits will continue. The chairs will be filled. The tolerance margins will be recalculated after particularly bad transits and adjusted, and then the adjustment will be normalized, and it will become the new standard until the next particularly bad transit. This is the nature of the system. But Elena kept me from knowing what I was logging for 27 years, and then, in the 28th year, she told me, and I think she told me because she was tired of the truth existing only in the minds of the people too exhausted to speak it clearly. The archivist serves the record serves the truth. The truth serves, in the end, the people who deserve to know it whenever they arrive and however long after the events described. I am recording this testimony from a shelter I will not name, on a world I will not identify. I was primary systems archivist aboard the Perseverance of Saint Alathea for 11 years. I filed this testimony in the sealed personal archive before leaving the ship. Copies exist in places I have arranged. Not because I believe the Inquisition will not find them, they may find them. That is a different kind of calculation than the one Elena made. When you travel, when you board a pilgrim vessel or a merchant hauler or a troop ship, and the Gellar field ignites and the ship slides into the warp, and the priests say the prayers, and the crew says the catechism, and the routine of transit settles over the passengers like familiar weight. I want you to know what is between you and the dark, not the generator, not the hull. A person, several persons, in chairs connected to cables in a room below the waterline of the ship, pressing their minds against a boundary that the warp has been pressing back against since before your civilization had a name. They do this in silence. They have always done it in silence. There are procedures, and there are logs, and there are tolerance margins, and none of them say what is actually happening, because naming it honestly would be more than most souls could carry. I am telling you now, I think someone should have told us sooner. I don't know what any of us would have done with the knowledge any more than I know what to do with it now. But the record should be complete. The record should be complete. I am dead now. I have been dead since the Inquisition finds this. Or I am alive and in a shelter I will not name. Both are possible. The testimony is filed either way. Aelena, Senna, Node 7. Node 11, the two lost in the compensation push. The ones before them on 43 transits before mine, on 10,000 years of transits before that. Their names are in the logs, the ones I had access to and the ones I did not. Someone archived them. Someone should read them. My name is Edric Sorn, and I was the Archivist of the Perseverance of Saint Alathea, and this is what I logged when I finally understood what I was logging. The transit continues. The chairs are never empty.